Do you know who I am? I built the wing that keeps this floor running. One call and you're finished by sunrise. That's possible, but you're still not walking past me. She wasn't supposed to still be standing. That's what the men watching the hospital entrance believed when they drove past at dawn. But they had miscalculated, and so had the man in the expensive coat, who had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his comfortable life. The ICU on the 5th floor of Mercy General never truly went dark. Machines kept their steady conversation with the silence. The air carried that particular mix of chemical cleanliness and human fear that only existed in places where life and its opposite stood inches apart. The nurses here moved without wasted motion, communicated in glances, and made decisions in seconds that most people would agonize over for days. Tochi Mensah had worked this floor for 7 years. At 33, she was the one charge nurses called when a situation unraveled, the one families found when they needed someone to tell them the truth gently but completely. She had the kind of steadiness that couldn't be taught in any program. It lived in her hands, in her voice, in the way a room settled when she entered it. She was also 8 months pregnant, and her back had been screaming at her since hour 3 of a 12-hour shift. She never mentioned it. She pressed one hand briefly against her lower ribs between rooms, took a breath, and kept moving. Her coworkers knew her schedule, knew her coffee order, knew she was extraordinary at her job. They didn't know much else. She kept it that way deliberately. She didn't talk about where she was from. She didn't bring up family. When someone asked about her life outside the hospital, she smiled the kind of smile that closed a conversation without offending anyone. Nobody knew she was the foster sister of a man named Jean Ho Seo. Jean Ho Seo did not exist in any law enforcement database. He had no social media, no digital footprint, no publicly traceable business. What he had instead was a reputation passed in whispers through the criminal infrastructure of the entire Western Seaboard. His organization had no name because naming something gave investigators something to search for. He was 29 floors above the street on any given day, watching a city that largely had no idea he existed, which was precisely how he preferred it. He had kept his world entirely separate from Tochi for years, not from shame, but because she had asked him to. She was 16 when she said it, sitting across from him in a foster home's kitchen at midnight, serious in the way only certain teenagers can be serious. "I want to earn my own life," she had told him. "I want nothing from that world, not protection, not money, nothing." He had looked at her for a long time and then nodded. He had honored that promise without exception. But some men, it turns out, are allergic to boundaries that weren't set by them. The elevator doors at the far end of the hallway opened at 1:47 in the afternoon. The man who stepped out wore a charcoal suit with the particular sheen of something handcrafted in Italy. His name was Carter Aldridge, 51 years old, a real estate developer whose name appeared on 3 downtown towers, a sports complex, and the new cardiac rehabilitation center 1 floor below where his gold-lettered donor plaque hung on the wall. He had a small, neatly wrapped cloth around his right hand, a cut from a wine glass at lunch, already cleaned and barely bleeding. He had sent his assistant ahead to demand a room. A young resident named Marcus stepped toward him immediately, voice measured, posture careful. He explained that this floor was intensive care, that the emergency department 2 floors down was the appropriate place for a minor laceration, that he would personally walk Mr. Aldridge down. Carter looked at him the way someone like him looked at obstacles they found mildly insulting. "Do you know who I am?" he said. His voice had the smooth, unhurried quality of someone who had never truly been told no. "I built the wing that keeps this floor running. One call and you're finished by sunrise." "That's possible, but you're still not walking past me." His expression shifted into something deliberate and cold. He reached into his jacket and removed a slim leather checkbook. He held it toward Marcus, who was still flattened against the wall, and said, "Write a number. Whatever it costs to move one of these patients, I don't care about their condition. I need this bed. Tochi spoke before Marcus could open his mouth. Put that away. Money doesn't alter the clinical reality of what's in these rooms. The patient in room 7 had a triple bypass 18 hours ago. He cannot be moved for a hand laceration. I won't allow it. Carter turned toward her slowly. You're a nurse, he said, and the word landed like something flung at her feet. You don't make the calls here. She met his eyes. On this floor, today, I do. What followed was the kind of performance that powerful men sometimes deliver when they sense the audience is captive. He talked about her education, her position, her uniform, her salary. He said things that made the nursing students at the station look anywhere except at the two of them. He used a particular tone that was designed to reduce a person to the smallest possible version of themselves in front of witnesses. Tochi stood through all of it, unmoved, and turned toward the wall phone to call security. That was when Carter hit her. The sound cracked through the ICU like something structural giving way. The flat of his palm connected with the left side of her face hard enough to snap her head sideways. Her clipboard hit the floor. She caught the edge of the nursing station with her shoulder, and both of her hands moved immediately to her stomach, cradling it, protecting it first, everything else second. She didn't fall, but she closed her eyes for one long second, and that second contained everything anyone in that hallway needed to know. The floor went silent, the way a room goes silent after something that cannot be taken back. Priya, a second-year nurse, stood at the medication station with both hands pressed flat against her chest. The security guard near the stairwell had his radio in his hand and hadn't moved. Marcus had not moved. Nobody had moved. Carter straightened his cufflinks. I think we understand each other now, he said. Near the fire exit at the far end of the corridor, a man in a dark gray coat stood with his back against the wall and his hands in his pockets. He had been there since Carter stepped off the elevator. He had watched everything with the complete stillness of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the moment to execute it. There was a tattoo visible above his collar on the right side of his neck, a tiger's eye, amber and open, staring forward. He didn't move toward Carter. He didn't raise his voice. He took out his phone, typed 3 words, and walked out through the fire door without a sound. Dr. Patricia Engel arrived 90 seconds later. She was the chief of medicine, 60 years old, sharp silver bob, the kind of woman who had spent 3 decades navigating institutions that hadn't always wanted her there, which should have made her different. It didn't. She walked in, read the room in seconds, Tochi still steadying herself against the counter, Carter standing with his arms folded like a man waiting to be thanked, and made her choice before she reached the center of the hallway. She chose Carter. Mr. Aldridge, she said, her voice warm in a way that turned Tochi's stomach. I sincerely apologize for this experience. Let's get you somewhere comfortable right now. Carter rolled his shoulders back. Your nurse was hostile and obstructed my care. I had no choice but to defend myself. Dr. Engel nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've already decided what they're going to do and are simply waiting for the other person to finish talking. She didn't ask for the security footage. She didn't ask a single witness what they had seen. She didn't look at the marks spreading across the face of the pregnant woman standing 10 feet behind her. She turned to Tochi and her voice changed completely. I'm terminating your employment effective immediately. Please return your badge and collect your personal belongings. The words landed with the particular weight of something Tochi had half expected the moment Engel walked through those doors and looked at Carter first. It wasn't the termination that broke something in her chest. It was the people around her, the nurses and residents and security staff who had witnessed everything and were now finding tremendous interest in their own shoes. 2 security guards walked her out, professionally, carefully, like they had been told to make it look procedural. She handed over her badge at the station without a word, emptied her locker into a paper grocery bag, and walked the length of the main corridor for what she understood was the last time. past the rooms of patients she had shepherded through the worst nights of their lives, past the break room where she had eaten alone more times than she could count because she was always covering for someone, past the room where she had sat with an elderly woman for 2 hours because the woman was afraid, and her children lived far away, and Tochi had simply refused to leave. The front doors parted. The cold came at her all at once. It was raining, the quiet, persistent kind. She stood on the wet pavement outside and opened her phone. There was already an email from a legal firm she had never heard of. Carter Aldridge was suing her for professional interference and emotional distress. She read it standing in the rain. Then she started walking. By the next morning, her bank cards stopped working at a pharmacy on the corner. Her accounts had been frozen before she woke up. Carter's legal team had moved with the kind of speed that money purchases. When she reached her apartment building, an eviction notice was fixed to her door with a single piece of tape, slightly crooked, like whoever posted it had been in a hurry. She went inside, sat on the floor with her back against the couch, put both hands on her stomach, and breathed until the shaking in her hands slowed to something manageable. She had left everything complicated behind her years ago because she wanted something she had built herself, something no one could point to and say, "I gave you that." She had constructed it slowly, year by year, shift by shift. It had taken one afternoon to dismantle. She sat with that for a long time. Then she stood up. She went to her bedroom closet, moved a box of winter things off the top shelf, and found the fireproof case behind it. Inside was a phone she had powered on once a year just to confirm it still worked. She had hoped she would never need it for anything else. She dialed from memory. Jin-Ho So picked up before the second ring. He already knew. He had been in the hallway. He had watched Carter's palm connect with her face, had watched her hands fly to her stomach, had watched Patricia Engel choose the donor without once looking at the mark on Tochi's cheek. He had walked out the fire door because Tochi had made him promise years ago that he would never move without her permission. He had spent the past 23 hours sitting with that promise in his chest like a coal. When her voice came through the speaker, quiet and frayed at the edges, he exhaled slowly and closed his eyes. "I need help," she said. Just those 3 words. "You don't have to say another thing," Jin-Ho said. His voice was the quietest it had ever been. "Get some sleep. I'll take care of it." He set the phone down on the glass surface of his desk, looked out at the rain-soaked city below his penthouse window, and made 5 calls. By the time the sun came up, Carter's morning had already begun to collapse. Carter found out at dinner. He was at a members-only restaurant called the Meridian, the kind of establishment where they recognized your face before you gave your name. He had ordered generously to celebrate what he was privately calling a very efficient Tuesday. When the card declined, the server returned with the expression of someone who would genuinely rather be anywhere else on earth. Carter called his banker. 7 missed calls already waiting on his screen. His company's stock had fallen 22% in 4 hours. 3 offshore accounts, held in separate jurisdictions specifically because those jurisdictions asked very few questions, were empty, not drained in any traceable way, just empty, like the funds were a misremembering. Then his head of security received a message. Carter watched the man read it, watched him go very still, watched him stand, slide his phone into his jacket, and walk out of the restaurant without making eye contact with anyone. Carter sat alone at a table set for 4, with a bottle of wine he could no longer pay for. He spent the night burning through favors. He had names, the kind of names that lived in phones with no cloud backup, men who had resolved situations that more legitimate professionals couldn't touch. He met the first one in a parking structure at 11, slid an envelope of emergency cash across the roof of a car, and showed him what had been waiting in his mailbox when he arrived home that evening. A black envelope, dark red wax seal, the impression of a tiger's eye. The man studied the seal for a moment. Then he pushed the envelope back across the car, picked up his own cash, and left without a word. The second man didn't sit down. He saw the seal from across the table and was already shaking his head before Carter finished the first sentence.
The third man, a heavy-set man with a scar across his chin and a reputation for accepting work that others declined on principle, looked at the seal, looked at Carter, and said it low and flat. "You put your hands on someone you never should have touched. There is not a person in this city who will take this job. The number doesn't matter." "Why?" Carter said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. The man looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the narrow space between them. "Because the person who sent that envelope doesn't negotiate terms. He simply arrives."
Carter drove to his private airfield at 1 in the morning. He had a plan. He had a jet, a go-bag, and a destination without an extradition agreement with anyone who might want him shortly. He was 40 feet from the stairs when the lights found him. 4 black SUVs rolling out of the dark perimeter of the tarmac like they had been parked and waiting for hours, which they had. 8 men stepped out. No weapons drawn, no raised voices. They simply moved to either side of him, covered his head, and drove. When the covering came off, Carter was kneeling on cold stone. The room around him was vast and almost entirely unlit except for the single source of light at the far end of a long table. Jin-Ho So sat there with both hands flat on the table and a cup of tea steaming beside him, looking at Carter with the complete absence of urgency that belongs to people who have already won. Carter's instincts defaulted immediately to the only posture he knew. "I have relationships at the federal level," he said, his voice doing something embarrassing at the edges. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jin-Ho slid a tablet across the table without speaking. It came to rest in front of Carter's knees. On the screen was the ICU security footage, every second of it. The shove, the shouting, the strike, Tochi's hands going to her stomach, Dr. Angel nodding like she was hearing pleasant news, the guards walking Tochi out through the corridor she had spent 7 years earning. Carter stared at the screen. Jin-Ho let the silence sit for a long moment. Then, "You thought she was alone," he said, quietly enough that Carter had to lean forward slightly to catch the words. "You thought no one was coming for her." He looked at Carter without expression. "She has me." A lawyer materialized from the shadows to Carter's left, carrying a document portfolio 3 inches thick. Jin-Ho laid out the terms without inflection. Every asset, the development company, the properties, the vehicles, the patents, the investment portfolios, all of it transferred into a legally structured trust that would fund affordable housing and maternal health services for low-income women across the city. The structure had been designed specifically to be irreversible. The emergency cash from the go-bag had already been collected at the airfield and was gone. Carter wept through the signing. The tears were real, but they were not the tears of a man who felt remorse. They were the tears of a man watching something leave his hands that he had spent his entire life believing could never be taken. When the last page was signed, the covering went back over his head. They drove for 25 minutes. When they put him out of the vehicle, he hit wet pavement and rolled before stopping, tore the covering off his head, and looked up at the sign above him. Hospital Emergency Entrance. The same building, the same pavement where Tochi had stood in the rain holding a paper grocery bag, freshly unemployed, 8 months pregnant, alone. Carter Aldridge sat in the rain in a ruined suit with nothing remaining of the life he had built. And then the police vehicles arrived because over the previous 72 hours, Jin-Ho had delivered 11 years of Carter's financial records to 4 separate federal agencies: tax fraud, embezzlement, laundered construction contracts, all of it organized and documented and delivered without a name attached. The officers stepped out. Carter didn't run. There was genuinely nowhere left to go. The room on the 8th floor caught the morning light in long, warm rectangles across the floor. It was quiet except for the small sounds that only exist in rooms where a new person has recently arrived. Tochi sat propped against the pillows with her daughter against her chest, looking out at the skyline, and for the first time in months, she felt something that took her a moment to identify. It was the absence of dread.
Her daughter had arrived the previous evening with considerable opinions about the timing and had expressed them at volume to everyone on the floor. She had her great-grandmother's brow and a serious expression that made the delivery nurse laugh and say, "This one already knows exactly what she thinks." She was perfect in the way that made all prior calculations about what mattered feel suddenly and completely recalibrated. Jin-ho stood near the window with his hands folded, looking at his niece with an expression Tochi had never seen him wear before. Something unguarded, something that had no tactical use whatsoever, which meant it was real. He had purchased this hospital 14 months ago through a sequence of holding companies whose trail took considerable expertise to follow. The board of directors had discovered the identity of their new owner only when the final transfer documents were filed. Then they knew. Within a week, Dr. Patricia Engel had submitted her resignation, which turned out to be slightly redundant because her termination had already been processed by the incoming ownership. Engel was currently employed on the second floor. The facilities department had been understaffed for some time. As Tochi watched her daughter's face, she heard the distant sound of a cart being wheeled along the hallway outside. She glanced up. Through the open door she could see her, older-looking somehow than Tochi remembered, moving carefully, eyes on the floor. Engel passed the doorway. She looked in, she saw Tochi, she looked away and kept moving, and Tochi let her go without a word. There was nothing left to say to her. She looked back at her daughter instead. Jin-ho came and stood beside the bed. He looked at the baby for a long moment and then looked at Tochi. "You good?" he asked. She laughed, the small, exhausted, genuine kind. "Yeah," she said, "I'm good." He nodded once, like something he had been carrying for a long time had just been set down. Across the city in a federal holding facility, Carter Aldridge sat on a metal bench in an orange jumpsuit and stared at the floor. The towers with his name on them belonged to someone else now. The club, the jet, the board members who had laughed at his jokes for a decade, all of it had redistributed itself into a world that had stopped requiring his participation. He had spent 51 years constructing a life in which he was the one who defined the terms. He finally encountered someone for whom his terms were simply not relevant. Tochi pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead and breathed in the warmth of her. The hard part was over, not because a powerful man had been brought completely to the ground, though he had, not because the woman who chose a donor over a colleague was now pushing a cart down a hospital corridor, though she was, but because Tochi was in this room, in this light, with her daughter breathing softly against her chest and her brother standing quietly at the window. And the world outside had no weight left to put on her. She had spent her entire adult life trying to build something ordinary and entirely her own. What she hadn't seen until now was that the people who love you sometimes build alongside you in the dark without ever letting you know they're there. The quietest people in the room are never the weakest. They're just the ones who haven't decided to move yet. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.